Welcome to the second video in the Heirloom Starter Kit series. In the first video, we went from a pillowcase to creating a baby gown. And in this video, we are going to do a fairly deep dive into the common construction processes you'll find in most heirloom and classic patterns. After completing this dress, you will feel more confident to tackle other patterns since you will have these common construction processes mastered. So let's get into it. We are first going to cover the commonly used embroidery stitches, and yes, you can totally do this. I'm going to walk you through every step, so grab that flourish and the sewing needle and let's get started. It is a good rule of thumb to cut an oversized piece of fabric when you are doing embroidery work. You want it to be big enough to fit into your embroidery hoop. So after you cut yours out, then make sure to orientate the grain vertically with the design. There is a grain line error on your pattern, and an easy way to do this is to make sure the selvage edge of the fabric is parallel to that grain line. From there, take your heat-activated pen and trace the design. I also like to trace the outline of the pattern piece, but tracing the seam allowances are not necessary. It is helpful though to pin your fabric to your pattern piece before you begin tracing so it doesn't move around on you. And you can see on this video that yes, while you can see through this fabric and trace the design, a light board does help quite a bit, especially for my tired mama eyes. But yeah, it's totally possible without one, so don't feel like you need to buy one in order to, dip your toe in the water and see how it feels. So let's grab that baby pink, the darker shade from your kit, just one strand, and tie a knot into the end. I actually like tying a double knot, just one right after the other, and then thread that through your needle. Often wetting the end is helpful, and then you can just trim away your DNA end. We are first going to do a bullion rose in the middle, and I think it's much easier to do bullions without an embroidery hoop. So to hold your fabric without an embroidery hoop, take the fabric and wrap it around your hand, and then tuck the top of the fabric in between your index and middle fingers. Notice I am leaving the points of my fingers out of this whole equation. You do not want to poke your finger into your fabric. This will cause a little bubble of fabric deformation to form, and unfortunately there's really no way to fix that. It'll just be a little stretched out bubble within your fabric. And yes, I have done it before, and most other people have done it before, and you will probably do it too. But it's something to be cautious of and to strive to avoid. But as a beginner especially, mistakes are going to happen, and that is okay. So I have the padded part of my index finger right underneath this bullion rose, and I bring my needle up on one end of the marked center of the rose, and then back into the fabric at the other end of the rose. So from there, keep your needle in your fabric and start those wraps. You can do this. It does not matter which direction you do the wraps, but you do want to do several, probably more than you may guess. I only did 4 for this first bullion, but I should have done more like 6. So make 6 wraps around your needle, and notice that the wraps are going to be snug on the needle, but not super tight. I can still move them easily along the needle, and that's the sweet spot that you want. From there, put your thumb over these wraps and pull your needle through. Fold that bullion back so it's going right into place, and then give your thread a little tug to secure everything down, and you'll see my bullion isn't super full because I didn't do enough wraps. So put your needle through your fabric at the end, and voila, your first bullion. Now let's do a second one for the center of the rose. I like to do 2. That's just how I like to do roses. So come up just next to that first bullion, and then insert your needle at the bottom, coming up again just a few threads away from that initial spot. Wrapping around your needle about 6 times, putting your thumb over those wraps, and pulling through. You can use that bottom wrap to turn the bullion down, and then put your thumb on top of all the wraps again while you give it another little tug. Send your needle to the wrong side of your work, And there you go, your first 2 bullions. Pat yourself on the back, seriously. And from there, I tie off by creating a loop and holding the thread coming out of your fabric. That's the trick to getting a knot that is fairly close to the surface of your fabric. So I continue the same process for those rose buds. And I'm using about 8 wraps here, and I'm doing the same method with this darker shade of pink. Now, one little trick with the rose buds is that you can do one side a little shorter than the other, let's say about 6 wraps in our case. Then move to the other bullion of the rosebud and make this a little longer, like 8 or 9 wraps in our case. And this will allow you the option of wrapping that longer bullion around the first shorter one, which is a neat, a nice little polished look, You can send your needle down on the shorter bullion side so the longer bullion wraps around the first one. It just kind of curves it around and has a nice little polished look to it. So now let's transition into our embroidery hoop to complete this motif. It is very helpful to have your embroidery hoop wrapped in fabric, and I have a detailed video on how to do that, but yes, mine is not currently wrapped, and that is a whole nother story. Anywho, there is a little dance to properly putting your fabric into an embroidery hoop. It's a 2-step dance between pulling your fabric, tightening your hoop, pulling your fabric, tightening your hoop. And you only want to pull in the directions of the straight and cross grains. So do not pull in the direction of the bias of the fabric. The bias of the fabric is where things are lovely and stretchy. So pulling here can cause this stretchy characteristic to get the fabric out of whack. And yes, you need a screwdriver. This is not up for discussion. No matter how strong you think your hands are, you cannot achieve drum taut on that fabric without a screwdriver. Once all is done, your fabric should sound something like this. Hence the whole drum taut comparison. Okay, now we are going to do these lovely leaves and stems. To do a leaf, we're going to use the Lazy Daisy stitch. And this is an easy stitch, and when you have a compilation of them, they look so beautiful. So it's like the best of both worlds. So tie a knot at the bottom of your thread and then come up on one side of that U shape. It doesn't matter which side. And then go to the other side of that U shape. And finally, come up at the center of the U. Now make sure your thread stays underneath your needle. That's key here. And you will have yourself a little U shape, okay? So to secure this U down, just put your needle on the other side of the thread. And there you go, a lazy daisy. Super easy, right? It's in the name, lazy daisy. So let's do that again. One end of the U, the other end of the U, and now the center of the U, keeping your thread underneath your needle and then securing that down by going on the other side of the thread. So to do this stitching on the stem, we are going to use the stem stitch. I know, I am here all day, such a jokester. So tie a knot at the bottom of your thread and come up on the end of this stem as I'm showing. Go over a little ways, maybe slightly larger than a 1/16 of an inch, something like that, and keep your thread below your needle. Now come up within that first stitch, and again, move over a little bit more than a 1/16 of an inch, not quite to an 1/8 of an inch here. We're doing baby style stuff, so we're keeping our stitches on the smaller side of life. So if you can think of this curve as a smiley face, we are keeping the thread on that bottom lip side of the smiley face. I know that's a little silly comparison or analogy, whatever, but it can help you remember which side to keep your thread in relation to the curve in your motif. For example, you see that other stem directly below the one that we are currently working on? Well, that's an upside down smiley face. So I'm going to keep my thread above that curve, which is where the bottom lip of the smile would be. You with me? So the lazy daisy is a stitch that, for me at least, works so well with or without an embroidery hoop. And in the situation when I'm not using a hoop, you can work the stitch in more of a fluid motion like so. Just a little FYI, but in an embroidery hoop, I prefer to do the 3 stabbing method instead of the sliding needle from step 2 to 3. I just want to put that out there, just so y'all know that. We can also make a lazy daisy around those rosebuds. You'll imagine that the U goes on the bottom half of the rosebud, and you will have yourself a lazy daisy. And then you go right into the stem stitch that we just went over, keeping your thread below your needle, like on that bottom lip side of the smiley face. Alrighty, let's do a buttonhole stitch flower. These are so fun and so easy. So again, tie a knot in your thread and then come up somewhere along the outside circle. Then go to the middle of the circle and again on the outside circle, about 1/16 of an inch away from that initial spot. Keep your thread underneath your needle and voila, your first buttonhole stitch. You keep doing that all the way around the circle and you will have yourself a buttonhole stitch flower. And you can apply this same idea to a number of things like this sweet little motif. And then how close you space your stitches is how much coverage you'll get from your thread. Now this isn't a requirement, but notice how I'm going in the center hole every time for this flower. Well, that's going to open up the threads here and create a little hole in your fabric. It's not actually going to create a hole, it's just going to open up the threads to look like a hole, which is just another layer of interest, I think. It kind of creates like a little eyelet sort of effect, if you will, in the center of the flower. So you'll finish this flower by taking a stitch over to secure that last little bit into place, and then just tie off on the back. Now let's learn how to do a French knot. You will come up at the dot and wrap your needle twice. I like to wrap my needle away from me, like in a clockwise motion in relation to my hand. Then insert your needle a few threads away from that initial spot. And here is the critical part. Pull your thread taut. If it does not look like a French knot at this point, take your needle out and redo it. It is not going to get any prettier by completing the process. So once you get the hang of them, French knots go quite quickly, and they are such a fun, easy way to add some sparkle to your work. Just a little bit of interest here and there, some texture. They are so fun. Okay, the final embroidery technique that we are going to learn on this dress is shadow embroidery. And I absolutely love shadow work embroidery. Holy cow, wait till you see this. It is super easy and it's one of my favorite things. So I'm taking that light pink shade and coming up at the bottom of this petal. I take one stitch, go over to the other side, and I take another stitch. And this is going to be the alternating backwards running stitch. Just go from one side to the other, which causes your thread to zigzag underneath your work. And it's those zigzags that fill the shape and create that shadow of a color effect. Just keep doing this for both of those outside petals, and then I switch to the darker baby pink shade for that middle petal. From there, I added 3 French knots to the flower, like 2 next to each other and then 1 on top, kind of creating like a little triangle, if you will. And yes, I realized at this point that we had not finished our bouillon rose from earlier. So let's take that lighter pink shade and come up to the top left corner of the center of the flower. Then go about 180 degrees across from there, and then back up to the right side of your fabric. And you'll create a bunch of wraps here. I used about 15. And grab those wraps between your thumb and index finger and then pull through. The wraps will go around the center of the flower and you will have your first petal. How fun, right? You just did your first petal. How cool. So now let's do the second petal. So coming up at the top right corner, again going about 180 degrees across from there and wrapping a whole bunch, say 15 or so. And then pulling that through and putting your needle back down, to the wrong side of your work. So finally, we'll take the same route with the third and final petal, but I like to make sure to put my needle just past that first petal. This will cause that third petal to wrap around and tuck into the first petal, which may seem like a small thing, but it really does help to make your rose look circular and fluid, just pretty instead of like choppy. Okay, we don't want lines here. We want curves. Alrighty, now we have our embroidery work done and we can move on into diving into all those construction techniques. Go ahead and cut out your front yoke piece and give that an ironing. But since you have bouillon stitches, be careful with your iron. It is best to put down a thick towel and then put your bouillons right sides together with that towel before ironing so you don't squash them. But I'm just using my ironing board as that thick towel. It's not quite as good, but honestly, I didn't need to get up. So there's the truth for you. Okay, so rally up your pattern pieces. You'll have a yoke front, a yoke back, a sleeve, a skirt front, and a skirt back. Okay, 5 pieces in total. And it's a great trick to work from one side of your fabric to the other. It's just a better, more efficient use of your fabric. So fold your fabric over so it's just wide enough to line your yoke, front, and back pieces, as well as the sleeve on the fold. You'll want to check that your grain is lined up. And if you want to check that your grain is lined up, you can measure from the selvage edge on one side, move over a bit, and check that measurement. Those measurements should be roughly the same. I mean, within like 1/8 of an inch is fine. They won't ever be exact, okay? But you want them to be close enough. Now you can pin those 3 pieces onto the fold and cut everything out. You'll need to repeat this process for the sleeve and back yoke since we need 2 of everything. But we already have 1 of the yoke fronts from the embroidery motif. You with me? So we need 2 of all these 3 pieces. So from there, we can cut out our skirt pieces, and you can absolutely cut all the way around the skirt piece, but I like to take a little bit of a shortcut of lining the skirt's length up to your fabric, taking a clip and then ripping along the grain. This is a super accurate and easy way to get the length of the skirt. So from there, I fold the fabric over and cut the side out, as well as that little curve at the corner. That curve at the corner is the bottom of the arm curve, okay, or the armscye if you want to use the fancy sewing term. You'll have to do this for the skirt fronts as well as the skirt back. Just cut 1 of each on the fold. So in total, you will have 1 skirt back cut on the fold, 1 skirt front cut on the fold, 2 sleeves cut on the fold, 2 yoke fronts cut on the fold, and 2 yokes backs cut on the fold. And now you're going to assemble those yoke pieces in what I like to call the bodice, or in our case yoke, ring method. You'll create a ring or circle, if you will, with your front pattern pieces across from each other and your back pattern pieces across from each other. Put the pattern pieces with right sides together and sew along the shoulder seams to connect all these pieces. You'll use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and remember that the seam allowance is the distance from your needle to the raw edge of your fabric. If your mind is drawing a blank, 1/8 of an inch longer than the 1/4 inch mark, which is likely marked on your sewing machine, whereas that 3/8 inch mark is not as common. Anywho, you'll do this for all 4 shoulder seams, and once you've sewn all 4 shoulder seams together, then iron those seams open. And these seams are known as a plain seam. It's the most common seam in sewing, that whole right sides together thing, sew along at once. That is a plain seam. Now you're going to put your yoke fronts together, lining up those shoulder seams, giving that an ironing, and taking it back to your machine so we can sew around the neckline at the 1/4 inch seam allowance mark. Start at one back and go all the way around the neckline, putting your needle down and turning your work as necessary to make pretty gradual curves. And finish at the other back end. So now we need to clip this curve. And how do we know that? Well, if we simply turned the yoke, it would be a bit of a hot mess of little puckers everywhere. But you can see I put the clip marks into 1/2 of the neckline, which is laying nicely, but the unclipped half is a mess of those little puckers. What is happening is the inside curve of the neckline, that raw edge of the neckline, is a smaller distance than the curve that we just stitched. So it's too short to open up, which causes those little puckers to form. And by clipping the curves, it allows that distance to open up and everything to relax into place and look nice and pretty. So now we are going to understitch the seam, and yes, you can absolutely do this, and understitching is so important. It really takes your garment from that "my mama made this look" to something polished. Y'all know what I'm talking about. So flip the entire seam of the neckline to the lining side, and then take that to your machine and stitch very close to the initial neckline seam. You won't be able to start all the way on the in the back, on that back corner, and that's just fine. But having the seam understitched prevents the lining from popping up while the garment is being worn, and it also just makes the curve lay better. So while I'm stitching, I make sure that the seam stays on the lining side, like it doesn't flop over to that right side of the dress. That would defeat the entire purpose of understitching. I also gently pull on the yoke pieces, and this is what the understitching looks like when you get done with it. So finally, I can trim those corners from the back ends, just to reduce the bulk back there, and flip this yoke right sides out. Normally I use a little wooden tool to push the corners to those back ends, but as a beginner, you're not likely to have that tool. And if that's the case, you can carefully use your shears instead. Of course, be careful not to poke too hard with your sharp scissors, but I did this all the time without issues before I got my wooden pointer tool. So it's totally doable. And you can see what a difference pushing the corners out makes. It's another way to polish your garment and just up your game. So give all of that an ironing, and let's move on to the front of the skirt. You'll put 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top of the skirt. You'll need 2 rows of stitches to keep those gathers secure while you're stitching over them later on. So you'll want to put 1 row on either side of where those permanent stitches will go. In our case, the permanent stitches are going at the 1/2 inch mark. So 1 row can be at, say, the 1/4 inch mark, and another row can be at, the 5/8 or the 3/4. You get the drift, 1 on either side of 1/2 inch. You don't need to mark this. I'm just trying to drive that point home for all you visual learners. So how long to make your gathering stitches? Well, many people just crank up their stitch length all the way, but for heirloom lightweight fabrics, I like to stay around that 3.0 or so length, because that gives you more gathers and it's a cleaner look in my opinion. You just get more gathers, they're tinier gathers. It's just, I like that around that 3.0 length. So I run 2 rows of gathering stitches. Of course, do not back stitch at all in this process, and leave the lining out of this entire step. The gathering step as well as the permanent stitches, we do not want to include the lining into any of it. So to gather the fabric up, I like to pick up the top threads as opposed to the bobbin threads, but either way will work. However, you need to pick one or the other. If you pull on the top and bobbin threads, that'll just cinch down the stitches together and you won't be able to gather anything. If you accidentally pull on both threads, just pull one stitch out of the fabric, with the use of a seam ripper or pin, whatever, and go again. I like to gather all the way and then adjust things out. So I'm taking this to the yoke front and I'm only focused on the length at this point. I pin the length at each end, putting it right side together with my yoke front. And then I adjust the gathers from there. And yes, the length may move a little bit in this process, and if that happens, just pull on those gathering threads again to correct the length. Then sew the 2 together at the 1/2 inch seam allowance mark, since the pattern calls for, a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just a friendly reminder to adjust your stitch length back down, as well as to keep your lining out of these stitches. You can easily remove the lower gathering thread by pulling on it, and I generally don't worry about that top one since you can't see it. But you could definitely remove it if you want to. Now we are going to do the same thing with the skirt back, but first we need to put a placket into it. And don't worry, you can do this. I'm going to walk you through every step. So your pattern has a little dot marked at the bottom of the placket. Go ahead and use your heat activated pen to mark this onto your fabric and then cut along the center of your fabric until you get to that dot. Now we need to get a strip of fabric for the placket. This is the strip that will enclose that slit that we just cut into the back of our skirt. And in my humble opinion, it is a good habit to create your own strip. There will be enough scrap fabric for this, but not relying on the pattern piece has several benefits. You just take some of that extra fabric, clip a 2-inch wide strip, ripping that along the grain. And not relying on the pattern means that you can always create a placket. Even if you lost this tiny little piece of, that tiny little pattern piece, which is easy to do, it also means that you don't have to worry about coming up too short on your strip when you are sewing this into place. You'll just wrap your strip around and cut it longer than you need, and I will explain more on that in a little bit. So put the placket strip right side together with the back of the skirt, keeping the skirt on top of the strip. Then sew the strip together, angling it off a bit. And you need to angle it off a bit so you don't get a big wad of fabric at the bottom of this placket. And this angle is why I recommend cutting your own strip longer than you need. I mean, if you take more of an angle than the pattern designer intended, then you can come up short in the length of that pattern strip, which is frustrating. So that's why I strongly recommend this method. You'll sew until you get to that bottom point of the placket, making sure to adjust the fabric towards you so you don't sew over any ripples of fabric. And once you get down to the bottom of the placket, put your needle down, lift your presser foot, and adjust the fabric away from you so there aren't any ripples to sew over. Now it may look like there's a few ripples left after this adjustment, but chances are you will be just fine. So continue sewing, angling the skirt back towards the placket strip. Then it's a good habit to check the bottom of the placket to make sure there aren't any ripples. From there, clip at the bottom of the placket to release the tension, and then trim up each of those bottom edges where the angling happened. Put the entire seam towards the placket strip side and give that an ironing. Then you can trim up the other side of the placket again because of that whole angle thing, so it's about 1 inch from the seam. If you want, you can mark this distance, but I find that eyeballing works just fine too. Fold the raw edge over once and give that an ironing, and then fold it over again until it lines up with the previous seam, giving that another ironing. And at this point, you could stitch the folded edge down with your machine, but I recommend doing this by hand on heirloom work, and I will show you how to do that later in the video. I just like to save all my hand sewing until the end so I can do it all in one place. For now, line up the top of the skirt so you fold the placket in half. The bottom of the placket needs a handful of stitches so it gives it a direction. You'll put a handful of angled stitches in the bottom, and the exact angle does not matter. 30 degrees, 45, 60, it is all good. Okay, so if we pin those folded edges in place for now, let's talk about the placket. It doesn't really come together very well as is. See, it's kind of awkward trying to bring the two sides together. So to remedy this, one side needs to be folded under. And which side gets the folding? Well, the rule is that girls are always right. I know. So for girls, the right side gets folded under and goes on top of the left side. And then the vice versa is true. But the good news here is that there is no placket police. After making dozens and dozens of garments for my first child, Audrey, I was so used to putting the right over the left that by the time my second child arrived, well, Henry has a bunch of garments in reverse, and that is just fine. But just make sure that one side does get folded under. That's the important part here. Now put 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top of the skirt. You'll need to do this on both sides of the skirt back, and a little trick to keeping those folded edges of the placket in place is to take a stitch into them. Next, gather at both sides and take that back to your dress. We're going to focus on one side at a time. So let's do the left side first. Adjust the length, pin that into place with right sides together, making sure to leave the lining out of this process. You'll line up the raw edges and then line up the edge of the placket to the center back mark, which is shown by the iron crease. Okay, so that folded edge of the placket is going to be in line with the iron crease here. And then adjust the gathers so they are evenly distributed. The placket is going to lay flat here and not get folded over. And then sew along the 1/2 inch mark, making sure to bring your stitch length back down. And once again, you are leaving the lining out of this process. Now let's repeat the same thing to the other side. And this time, the placket gets folded under. And it's helpful to put a pin in that folded position. And then put the yoke back right sides together with the skirt back. Pin everything and adjust those gathers. And that folded edge placket should line up with the iron crease mark on the yoke. And then again, a friendly reminder to leave the yoke lining out of this step. So stitch that in the 1/2 inch seam allowance mark. And now we can iron those lining edges up about 1/2 inch. You're turning the raw edges towards the inside of the dress on the yoke front as well as those yoke backs. And it's these folded edges of the lining that will conceal the waist seam later on. Like I said, I like to save all my hand sewing until the end, but you could definitely do it now if you wanted. It's just a matter of personal preference. So for now, I just pin those in place. And now we're going to move on to those sleeves, and you got this. Seriously, you're going to venture into the worlds of sleeves, and it is going to be all good. You can do this. So I did this out of sequence, but first copy that elastic line onto your sleeve. And to finish the bottom edge of the sleeve, fold the bottom edge up about 1/4 inch, and then again about another 1/4 inch. And this should be folded with the wrong side of the fabric facing up, so these folds get put on the wrong side of your sleeve. Are you with me? And then stitch that folded edge like so. And now we're going to learn how to insert some elastic via a zigzag casing. So cut a piece of elastic so it's 4 inches long. And you'll start on one end, matching it up to that line that you marked earlier, making a few stitches, back tacking a few times, and then stitching to a zigzag. My settings were 4.5 width and a 1.2 length. You want the zigzag to be wide enough so it doesn't pierce through your elastic. You'll pull on the elastic as you're stitching and keeping it placed on that marked elastic line until you get to the other end, and then switch back to a straight stitch, back tacking a few times through the elastic. And there you go, a cinched in sleeve via a tiny piece of elastic. You just did that. That's so cool, right? So now we can put our 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top of the sleeve. There's a dot marked on the pattern piece of the sleeve, and you'll go from this dot to the dot on the other side. Gather that sleeve up and match it to your dress, making sure those lining edges stay folded under. And then stitch around the sleeve at the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance mark. So from there, trim up the raw edges to about 1/4 inch and zigzag them to tidy things up. Yes, one day you will insert a sleeve via a French seam, but this is a great option until then. Okay, so what about positioning the seam under the sleeve? Well, if you put it under the dress, things just kind of fall flat. But if you put the seam underneath the sleeve, then it adds some support and it pops that sleeve up. So it's a good thing to iron the sleeve seam towards the sleeve. And we are so close to finishing this dress. Say with me, you can do this. So pin the side of the dress together, making sure that the sleeve seam is pinned towards the sleeve as we just talked about. And you're pinning the dress with the wrong sides together because we're going to do a French seam. So sew along the 1/4 inch mark and then trim that up to 1/8 of an inch. Open the dress up and give that an ironing. Then fold the back dress together so the right sides are touching. Iron that seam down into place and now stitch about 1/8 of an inch away to finish the French seam. Repeat that for the other side, and then we're ready to work on hemming our dress. How exciting! So it's a good habit to iron French seams toward the back of the dress. And then to hem the dress, I fold the bottom raw edge up about 1/4 inch and iron that into place. And I do that all the way around the dress. I'm just eyeballing it. It's easy enough to eyeball 1/4 inch. And then I measure 2.5 inches from that iron edge towards the dress. The hem allowance for the dress is 2.5 inches wide, which is where that measurement came from. So I pin at one place, measure over a bit, and then pin at another place. And at this point, I've got 2 points, and 2 points make a line. So I iron that line into place, and I continue this process all the way around the dress. So to hand stitch the hem in place, I use that same DMC 50 weight thread we've been using this entire time, and I come up a little bit away from the folded edge, in between the layers of fabric so I can hide my tail. This is such a good habit to get into. It makes your work look so neat. So I tie on by creating a loop and then wrapping my needle around that loop twice and pulling tight into a knot. And then we're going to whip stitch this hem down. So I get a few threads from my dress fabric and then a few from the edge of the hem, and I continue this process all the way around the hem. It goes quite quickly, and to finish, I do that same loop wrapping thing to secure my thread into a knot, and then I send my needle back between the layers of fabric to hide the tail. We also need to hand stitch those linings into place. So first I trim up that seam to reduce the bulk, and then I tie on in the same manner, hiding my tail through the layers of fabric, creating a loop and going through that loop twice. And then I stitch from a machine stitch to the folded edge of the lining, and I repeat that until I get to the other side. And finally, we're going to hand stitch the placket into place, and I apply the same concept as before. I do one half of the placket at a time, so I tie off and secure my thread at the bottom of the placket, and then I start again on the other side. Last but certainly not least, we've got to put some closures into our baby dress. And between this garment being for a newborn, who are only easy to dress, let's face it, it's like dressing an adorable, sweet-smelling, slippery fish, and it being a beginner's project, we're going to insert 2 snaps. I much prefer metal snaps to the plastic ones. So to install these, I'm going to double up on my thread for some extra strength. And I secure on the left side of my garment with that loop wrapping method that we've gone over before, and then I insert the female side of the snap. I go through the hole of the snap and then back through the hole to create a little knot, and then I take my needle between the layers of fabric as I transition to the next hole in that snap, and I repeat the same thing. When I get to the last hole, I wrap the needle twice around the loop and send my needle through the layers of fabric, and voila, half of the snap is installed. I repeat this process for the other half of the snaps, and I did 2 snaps total. And you've just completed an heirloom dress filled with just about all the techniques you need to make a ton of other heirloom and classic garments. You should feel so proud of yourself. I am proud of you. I hope you had a ton of fun and you learned a lot, and I will see you back for the 3rd garment in this beginner heirloom starter kit. Of course, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. And as always, I appreciate y'all for watching, and I hope to catch y'all next time.